Here we are in session number 4. People are starting to join. Others coming. All right, everybody's here. Hope everybody can hear me fine. Hope you had a good week. Let's start on this third and fourth principle now. There are overlapping issues, obviously, in Sabzavari, but I thought rather than me reading those two sections back to back, I would just read these two sections of the Wisdom of the Throne. And then if there are questions or points that you want to raise from out of Sabzavari, we can then look at those specific ones. So let me just start now on this third principle, and then we will get cracking into the fourth, and then we'll have our discussion. So the third principle, deriving from the source of illumination concerning the uniqueness of the necessary being, the wajib al-wujud. He says, the necessary being is one and without a partner. Ahadun wala bila sharik. Because he is complete in reality, perfect in essence, infinite in power and intensity, and because, as you have learned, he is the pure reality of being, the pure reality of being unlimited and without bound. For if his being had some limit or particularity in any respect, it would have to be limited and particularized by something other than being. There would have to be something with power over him, limiting, specifying, and circumscribing him. But that is impossible. So there's no good and no perfection of being that does not have its source in him and grow out of it. Here is the proof of the affirmation of his uniqueness, of his ahadiyya. The necessary being cannot be multiple, because if that were so, it would require postulating a being both necessary and yet circumscribed in its being as the second member of a pair. But then he, that is the first necessary being, could not encompass every being, since there would turn out to be another being that did not belong to him and did not derive or emanate from him. In turn, this would result in his having a privative aspect of impossibility or contingency, so that he would have to be one of a pair and composite of being in a particular restricted quiddity like other contingent beings, and therefore could not be included in that reality of being which is unmixed with any limitation or with the privation implied by this difference. Thus it has been determined that he has no second in being, and that every perfection of being is a sprinkling of his perfection, every good a glimmering from the radiant light of his beauty. For he is the source of being, and everything else is subordinate to him, dependent on him for the substantiation of its essence. Now, I don't know if any of you picked this up, even though on the surface, Mulla Sadra is basically targeting Ibn Kamuna, but some elements of this argument here in this third principle also by inference criticize the very early apophatic notions of the Godhead in Ismailism, because the originator, the God beyond God, who produces the first intellect, doesn't have any kind of relation to the world. It is the first intellect that does in that old Ismaili scheme. So in a sense, Mulla Sadra is also sort of by inference also criticizing this notion, because early Ismaili metaphysics, a little later they do, but early Ismaili metaphysics doesn't quite resolve this problem that Mulla Sadra put his finger on right here. So number 4, a misleading delusion and its removal concerning the fundamental distinction between the concept and the reality of being. He says, surely the feeblest and most inadequate ways to prove the truth of the affirmation of divine unity is that followed by certain of the most recent thinkers, or mutaakhirun, who mistakenly associate their method with the direct experience of some of the godlike sages. Here he has Fakhruddin Razi in mind. May God preserve them from such delusions. This approach is based on the fact that the derivative concept of that which exists, al-mawjud, is something general and all-inclusive, while being, al-wujud, is particularly real and unknowable in its innermost core. Now, it is admissible, they said, that the being which is the source of the derivation of the concept of that which exists is something self-subsistent. That is the reality of the necessary being, and that the being of everything else is equivalent to the dependent relation of those things to the necessary being. The concept that which exists, mawjud, then would be more general than the reality and more general than everything else which is dependently related to it. Therefore, the meaning of that which exists must be one of these two things, either the self-subsistent being or that which is dependently related to it. And the criterion of this, that is, which is the origin of the concept, that which exists, must be which of them is the source of effects. So far, there was no problem with their reasoning. But for those who are napping, even an easy matter is a great burden. For it is true, the being, if by the one means the self-subsistent being, could be called that which exists, al-mawjud. But these people overlook the very crux of the matter, which is whether or not his essence, when he be exalted, is identical with the meaning of that absolute being whose various modes or individual manifestations are established in things. This is where he's introducing tashkik, the gradation in being. This way of realizing the inner unity of being in all of its manifestations was barred to them because they had already affirmed that there was no meaning to the absolute being that comprises all that exists, except for an abstract derivative notion reckoned among the purely mental intelligibles and corresponding to nothing real. I wish that I knew how someone proficient in grammar and usage could consider a certain expression, such as that which exists, al-mawjud, to be derivative, and yet not understand the concept of the source of such a derivation. How could the derivative term be the best known of all concepts, since that which exists on their view was immediately and self-evidently known by everyone, while its source remained the most hidden of unknowns, indeed impossible even to conceive? And how could the derived meaning be one, while its source was indeterminate between two things? One of them, that essence which is unknowable in its innermost core, and the second consisting in the relation to that unknown, right? Not the unknown, not the thing itself, but the relation. For surely the relation to the unknown is also unknown, right? So if we make that either one of these things unknown in their relations, then that this whole scheme just like collapses. Basically what he's saying. No, the truth of the matter is that this general concept, which is the source of derivation of the concept, that which exists absolutely, is simply another title for something which is realized in all things, numbered according to their number, and predicated of them according to varying degrees of intensity and weakness, priority and posteriority. And the most perfect and the most intense of beings is the truly real being, which is the pure reality of being unmixed with anything else but being. With respect to himself, he's the most obvious and manifest of beings, but because of the very excess of his manifestness by which he overwhelms and overpowers the senses of the ordinary minds, he has become veiled from man's understanding and vision. Remember, we spent a lot of pages of the Fusus al-Hikam dealing with iterations of this argument. Thus, the aspect through which he is hidden to ordinary perception is precisely that which he is manifest in the awareness of the enlightened knower. The question of the affirmation of divine unity depends on this. It can only be resolved in this way, not by any other at all. And that was the fourth proposition of this first part. So if you have any issues that you want to discuss about Sabzavari, because there is some overlap between what I just read and what Sabzavari was saying in those two chapters of the Sharaman-Zumeh, where he's talking about quiddities. There's some features of Sabzavari's argumentation on the quiddities I don't completely follow and agree with, because he's kind of trying to make an even sharper separation between the reality of being and quiddity than Mulla Sadra would necessarily allow. But nevertheless, the argument kind of overlaps between the wisdom of the throne and himself. Anyway, the floor is open. Whatever you want to talk about, take it away. Who wants to go first?
Hi, there's a specific sentence that is tormenting me. I'm tormented by the sentence. So it's the one where it says it's in which section?
Which book, Mulla Sadra or
Yeah,
Sabzavari?
the Mulla Sadra. My apologies.
No problem.
It's on the 102nd page.
Hmm.
So it starts off with, "But these people overlooked." Okay, you
Hmm.
follow me? But these people overlooked the very crux of the matter, which is whether or not his existence, may he be exalted, is identical with the meaning of that absolute being whose various modes or individual manifestations are established in things. I'm just not sure what to make of this absolute being whose various modes he's speaking of, except
Right.
to say when he's talking about that which exists as opposed to being. So then that which exists would correspond to the absolute being whose various modes or individual manifestations are established in all things, and his essence would then refer to the being. That's the only parallelization I can make, but I don't know.
He just got through with, he's coming to the main point. The main point that he's trying to make with this argument is that if you turn the concept of being, wujud, into circumscribed mojud, claiming that the existent is the known and the existence, the actus essendi, is the unknown, right? This poses a very insoluble metaphysical problem. And so he's questioning, why can't these people admit the act of being itself? If the existent is the known, then the source of it is the should be the ultimate known, in at least in a predicative sense rather than in a you know in an epistemological sense. So he is raising a very valid argument that if we posit the verb to be to upon anything, right? Then that verb to be, the actus essendi, the act of being itself, is the primary thing, right? And that what becomes existence in that particular instance is a derivative of that. But yet, people like Fakhri Razi or even the Aristotelians, you have a problem with this concept because their conception of what being is what they call amre etibari. Amre etibari is like a consensus reality. We know something doesn't exist, but we kind of, as a kind of a placeholder, we say we predicate existence to it just as a convention. So the verb to be is just an amre etibari. It has no further reality beyond that. And Mulla Sadra is saying that's nonsense. And here's the reason. Because if you posit an existent as being existent, right, then that act of being itself is the primary thing that makes this existent known to be existent, rather than the other way around, right? Otherwise, you end up in an infinite regress, which is what Sabzavari then puts his finger on those two sections of the Shahr Manzume, right? So it's not even about not wanting to have an infinite regress for the sake of not having an infinite regress. It's like, what is that thing? What is its isness? What is that quiddity? Does that quiddity exist by virtue of itself? Does that essence exist by virtue of itself? Or does it exist by virtue of existence? So once you posit that that every quiddity, every essence, everything exists by virtue of existence, then the next part of this argument is that therefore, which is what Sabzavari gets into in the first part of that third chapter, is we get into a situation of analogicity. So then we have degrees of existence. The existence itself is unitary and one, right? It's that then every existence becomes just basically a more intense or less intense of that universal existence. And this is why he then ends that part, that section, by saying the question of the affirmation of divine unity depends on this. It can only be resolved in this way, not by any other means at all. And he's right about that. Because any other way that you try to resolve this question of, the actus essendi, ends up in this infinite regress, just of multiplicities without ending up at a originating source, a necessary being. So it interrupts even the whole notion of a necessary being, which is what, as a kind of a postulate, Ibn Kamuna originally posited. But like I pointed out, this can also to some degree be criticized of some of the earlier Ismaili theosophers themselves as well, because they didn't quite resolve the question of being in their own cosmology.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. Yeah, because I understand what followed this particular sentence. It's just the way it was phrased, and I think a lot of it's because of the way that they wrote. So when they talked about the absolute being whose, and then they capitalized those three words, I think they should have capitalized the rest of the sentence. As an absolute being whose various those each of those words should be capitalized because you're characterize that entire thing. Whereas if you pay undue attention to these words absolute being, then you're sort of missing that forest for a specific tree.
Yeah.
Or missing the forest for the root. If
Yeah.
that makes any sense.
Exactly.
Okay. All right,
Yeah.
thank you so much.
Sure. Anybody else? Okay.
I went back and I tried to reconstruct the arguments from all of these sections. And so I was thinking about the argument for, I can't find it. But the arguments for sections 1 and 2 made really good sense to me. Like they seem like good, they're very coherent, like I can follow the premises, conclusion. They seem like good arguments. Like the argument in the first section seems like a solid argument for both the existence of wujud and the asalat al-wujud.
Yeah.
I actually think it's a really good. I was thinking about how someone like Ahsa'i would respond to it, and I'm not sure. This is a problem that I come up with whenever I read Ahsa'i, because there's this idea that essence exists. Like his gripe is that essence is also something that exists extramentally, but I always wondered about how you could say that essence exists separately from the existence of existence, because the very idea of existence is already in wujud and not in mahiyya. So that seems like it's a very like simple, like direct argument for asalat al-wujud. Like he just, it's like a short syllogism. And the argument in the second section is also, it makes sense for the simple being all things, because if there were well, I mean, we went through it, but the third argument is the one that I don't know exactly what the point of the argument is. When I reconstructed it, it seemed to kind of just reiterate the same thing in the second argument, or at least there's an implication in the second argument that maybe he's just bringing out more explicitly, because
the second
this argument.
Just remember, the second argument is actually more a critique of the both the Ash'ari as well as to some degree the peripatetic argument. Remember, Fakhr Razi was kind of straddling both worlds. He was a theologian mainly, but he was also subscribing to some of these more popular peripatetic notions about ontology. And his argumentation, although it's analytical, is just falls by the wayside. And this is what Mulla Sadra is primarily arguing against. So what he's arguing in that second part, he's basically arguing against Fakhr Razi and his notion about what exists, the existent and the existences, because Fakhr Razi ends up in this kind of aporia about this problem between essence and existence, and just he just basically says we can't resolve this question. That question of being on the absolute level is the indeterminate of the indeterminate, and so we can't even postulate it as a philosophical or let alone a theological axiom, and tries to then absolve God, the being of God, from that question of wujud, bima al-wujud. And so what Mulla Sadra is doing is he's objecting to this. He's saying, how do you not understand this question? it's just it's just an issue of analogicity. That is the point that you need to get, not the question of existence itself as an axiom of predication.
I think we're talking about different arguments. I should have specified. I meant the second section, the second chapter.
Okay.
The simple being is all things.
Okay.
Yeah. That one makes sense too. But the reason the third section argument confuses me is because, well, I don't know exactly what he's trying to get at, because if he's arguing for the wahidiyya, right, what's translated as uniqueness, that seems already implied in the second argument, because simplicity seems to imply uniqueness, right? Because if it's simple, then that means there's nothing that stands over against it. That's the only way that it could be simple, because if there was anything against it, then it would have two aspects, one by which it's itself and one by which it's not the other thing, and so it would be composite. So like the concept of wahidiyya already seems to be included in simplicity. So I was just a little bit like confused about the exact purpose of the argument. I mean, he's starting with talking about wajib al-wujud, so there's a difference there, and I would have expected that he would make the argument in terms of contingency, but he kind of does. But he ultimately he just seems to talk about simplicity and compositeness again. So it seems to just go back to like
I read this. Okay, I know what you're saying. Okay, the way I have looked at this is Mulla Sadra's attempt, and you get a more detailed version of this in the Asfar, where he's taking Ibn Arabi's notion of the subsistence of the contingent as the necessary by virtue of that relationship with the necessary being that we read in the very first chapter of the Susalika, and he's trying to postulate it in this sort of Avicennan kind of way. This is the way I read that particular thing, because the concept of necessity and the necessary being in Mulla Sadra is very important. Even probably I would say this very notion is more important to Mulla Sadra than Ibn Arabi himself, because what Ibn Arabi seems to do with the concept of wajib al-wujud is not entirely clear, although the argument that he puts before us does make sense. But from an Avicennan perspective, he's sort of collapsing many different predications all into the same thing, Ibn Arabi is. Whereas what Mulla Sadra is doing, he accepts the conclusion of the argument that Ibn Arabi puts before us. But what he wants to do is now then denude any possibility of any absolute necessary being anything else as being necessary in that absolute sense of the wujud al-mutlaq. This is what he's attempting to do with this concept of the wajib al-wujud.
Okay. I'll try to think of it in that light, because I mean, for me, he seems to come back around to simplicity by the end of it.
But he does this throughout this first part. He keeps going back to the issue of the basit al-haqiqa. So it's most of these postulates that he's putting before us in this first section is in one way or another a reiteration of this whole concept of the basit al-haqiqa over and over again. And he's just arguing it from different angles to establish it as the final, as both the axiom, the premise, and everything just revolves around this idea. Yeah.
That makes sense. Okay, thank you. A related question to that is I'm not sure like what is supposed to be, because as I was constructing the arguments, they're like rational arguments, but these qaida are all supposed to be like ladunni, arshi, and mashriqi. So I was trying to think of where that comes in, is if it's like at the first premise of each argument, or if it's the whole thing, or he's doing both. He's doing like here's the illumination, but then here's a completely rational demonstration, or because some of these seem to be like they could exist on their own as just rational arguments, like the first one.
But the point with Mulla Sadra is because, like I said in the first section, that this is a theoretical text, with an assumption by the person who's reading it that is going to kind of inform that noetic experiential dimension, right? So he's basically packing this text with all of his a summary of his philosophical postulates that he's already written about in the Asfar and the Shawahid al-Rububiyyah and elsewhere. But he wants to kind of now bring this all into kind of an experiential dimension, but without talking about experience, which Mulla Sadra rarely ever does, of his own anyway. But this is what he's trying to do. So he wants the reader of his book to kind of start to intuit these things from their from as an ishraq, as an illumination that then adumbrates their understanding of the arshi knowledge, which is the noetic knowledge itself. And he wants to do this in two modes. So he's trying his logical postulates as postulate would be the afari, okay, the horizon, the manifest. But the conclusion that a given reader who is Gnostic or oriented that way is deriving from this is supposed to be the anfusi. This is the kind of the unspoken dialectic of each of these qa'idas in this book.
So what exactly is meant to lead the reader to the tahqiq? Like what part of it's just the whole argument?
At every point of the argument that he's making in this first section, right? He is re-articulating a version of the simplicity of being as the asala, as the primacy of everything, right? So he wants the reader with that kind of a dhawqi inclination to kind of glean immediately as an illumination of how the arguments in each of them is leading them back to that primacy of being. Then the reader is supposed to then locate their own experience of things epistemologically within that. And that is both the illumination and also the arshi kind of knowledge of that particular principle.
Okay, so that also helps to explain why I'm finding that the arguments are reverting back to the same points.
Yeah.
Okay, that's by design. Okay, thank you.
Sure. I have to re-emphasize this noetic element in this book is very central, although he doesn't really, talk about it in the way like say even Arabi does. Where he's either talking about his own experience or he's talking about the experience of the people. And he's giving us, these sometimes very wild Quranic commentaries in the Fusus al-Hikam as well as the Futuhat. Mulla Sadra is approaching exactly the same issue, but from this very didactic, Aristotelian, kind of logical element, but with the assumption that the reader is going to immediately grasp this whole noetic dimension to it.
So this is kind of maybe a weird question.
Yeah.
So what does it mean if when I'm reading this stuff and I understand it and it makes sense to me? I don't think I've had any noetic experiences or whatever. I'm not some enlightened being. I make mistakes. I do stupid things. I get distracted. Whatever. I don't know. It makes sense to me and I follow. I'm like, wow, intuitively this makes a lot of sense. But I don't know. It's presuming some sort of experience that I wouldn't say as something that's normative for me, at the very least.
Look, the way that I approach all of these texts, whether it be Mulla Sadra, Ibn Arabi, or anybody else, is that you got to be able to follow these authors by bouncing off your own inner experience in what they're saying, right? This is part of that learning process of a text like this. So if not Mulla Sadra, let's say Rumi. If you're reading the Masnavi, for example, right? One of the things that a teacher of the Masnavi is supposed to do is that while you're reading these stories within stories of the Masnavi, right? They're encouraging you simultaneously to try to then reflect these stories and metaphors and symbols to your own life experience. Like the first story in the first book of Masnavi is about this, king that falls in love with a damsel who's in love with somebody else. And, his heart stricken, so he calls in a peer, a sage to, try to cut the love of this damsel for the one she loves to fall in love with the king. So all this whole love triangle and all of that. And when you start relating to your own experiences as this story is being told, where the elements of the narrative then start to gain a very transcendental symbolic thing, and you start to reflect these symbols into your own experience of life, your own life, right? Then they gain that immediacy, and these concepts and ideas in their multifaceted reality start to have a very personal application very fast. It's not that apparent for a lot of people. This is the difference between, for example, teaching a text as part of a university curriculum and teaching a text as part of an initiatic one, right? Where the text becomes alive. This is also how a lot of, whether Sufi orders or esoteric brotherhoods in the Muslim world, have taught the Quran. They don't teach the Quran in the way that, say, a madrasa teaches the Quran, to its advanced curriculum, where you go through a verse and then the tafsir is about, what the asbab and nuzul is, what were the circumstances of the revelations. So then it becomes kind of a historical gloss on each of these ayat. What these esoteric schools do is that, how do these ayat, how do these verses of the Quran, how are they applying to your life? What is resonating with that noetic dimension of your life with these various ayat of the Quran? And Mulla Sadra is doing exactly the same thing. Ibn Arabi does this exactly the same thing. In fact, Ibn Arabi, because his logic is so radically nonlinear, right? By design, he is trying to shock you, or especially shock the orthodox mentality, to allow these ideas that he's talking about to penetrate into them, rather than to take these ideas as kind of this, didactic thing and then unpack it from an academic sense and put context and, where is this being influenced by, and who said what, and what is the basis of this, etc. That all is okay on its level, but there's this deeper dimension to what this text is trying to convey. And that is why it's supposed to orient you. And so, since Mullah Sadra is very deliberately titling these sections and chapters by, phrases like mashriq, the place of the Orient, and ishraq, the actual illumination that comes from this place of the Orient, etc. These are the things that he's trying to convey to you, that, I'm trying to orient you into understanding on that, not just on your head level, but on your deeper intelligence of your heart, of what this primacy of being is supposed to be about. So this is ultimately how you're supposed to read that text. And so then this makes the difference between a text that is just the artifact, right, which most human beings deal with, most books and texts anyway, and a text that is supposed to be alive and have that theurgic element to it, where there is a real world interaction between you and this text, right, where the world becomes text. This is the title of an article that Juan Cole wrote about many years ago about Sheikh Ahmed Al-Said, when he and I were still talking. That is a great title, the world as text and the text as world. So then you enter that dimension of the microcosm, macrocosm. And in the traditional philosophical or theosophical rather setting, even many years ago in the Hosa itself, a teacher who would teach a text of Mulla Sadra, whether it be the Asfar or even someone like Avicenna, would approach the teaching modality of a text in such a fashion, right? And that's where you get this whole thing of a text being transmitted to a student. So they're not just, learning the intellectual elements of a text, right? They're also being oriented towards that non-linear and non-phenomenal or noumenal kind of reality of what that text is supposed to tell them.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Anybody else? Shane, Nathan, Hassan?
Uh,
Here, I will take on Sabzavari.
What page?
Uh, it is the 48 page in the Arabic.
Oh, okay, okay. I don't have the Arabic in front of me, but that's okay.
So the crux of the argument, which I see, he is speaking about the obsession for tanzih of the Ash'aris and the Mu'tazilis.
Yeah.
And he is saying, first, they are so obsessed with tanzih
Mhm.
that they even deny that the meaning of the word existence, wujud, it is the same meaning when we apply it to the reality of God and to the other things. So they are so radical.
Yeah.
And in denying this common meaning of existence applied to God and to the created things, uh, basically they are denying any meaning when we are speaking about it is meaningless, ultimately meaningless when we are speaking, for example, when we are saying that God is existing.
Yeah.
That is the one thing. And then it is proceeding and he's saying it is the same problem with them when they are speaking about the attributes of God. For
Yeah.
example, as knowledge and all other his qualities and attributes which are mentioned in the different dua and adhkar and awrad and so on.
Yeah.
And he's saying if we are proceeding by their logic, that we cannot attribute a common meaning between the attributes of God and our attributes, then ultimately all this dua, awrad, and so on become completely meaningless.
Yes.
And all of this is because they are misunderstood fear of shirk, sharing something common between God and the created things. And here I would like to proceed that indeed this understanding of the Ash'ari school, and don't know how much about the Mu'tazilis, but let's say to some degree with them, it is indeed depriving us from the our intermediate contact with the divine. It makes it something which is completely inaccessible. And here I would like to add that in the Ismailis, even they do have also this perfect tenzih, but the difference with the Ismailis is that they attribute all the positive qualities to the Imam, for
Yes.
example.
Yeah.
So we are not deprived with any kind of direct experience, but with the Ash'aris and the Mu'tazilis, they do not give you any substitute when you can direct your direct contact to, and that it's very depriving.
Yeah. Um, yeah, I agree. But I also think that the classical Ismaili or the popular Ismaili concept resolution to this problem between transcendence and immanence itself has problems that they cannot properly resolve. Whereas the Ibn Arabi and this whole tendency of the Akbarians leading up to Mulla Sadra do actually, in my opinion, resolve this adequately because the Imam or the complete human insanic Kamil can both be the immanent manifestation of God while also being the veil of God simultaneously. where you have the best of both worlds with the Akbarians. So you can find God in the horizons as the Imam, but also in themselves as the totality of things reflecting to you, simultaneously. So you can, so then this becomes a real Tawhidi situation where then phenomena just collapses into just being an illusion. That, you know what I mean? So that whether you're looking at the Imam or looking at other than the Imam at yourself as you at your inner being, the Imam of your being, right? It just becomes a continuum of that Tawhid. But in classical Ismaili theology, this is not completely resolved until we get into the post-Alamut period, where they begin to resolve this problem. And that is because of the revolution that occurred in Alamut under Hassan II, ala Zikri Salam. But with the Asharis and the Mutazilis, they have such a problem of trying to understand what Sabzavar calls cognation in the concept of being, in the concept of wujud, right? And that they end up completely stripping this ta'til that Ibn Arabi was constantly criticizing this Fusus al-Hikam becomes their modality of talking about God. And the implications of this are very, very serious, because then this raises very fundamental questions about the possibility of a human or a believer having any kind of relation to God. So then what does that make of their actions, of their devotional action, prayer, tawassul, all of this stuff becomes irrelevant, even including the performance of the Sharia itself becomes irrelevant. Because if there is no cognation in the concept of being that unites the abd and the rab, right, then what is the point of any of this? So and this is the classical deist position where, yes, God exists, but everything else that we know of God is just nonsense. And there's no Sharia, there's no morality, there's no ethics, there's nothing, there's no relation between that and this. And what Sabzavari is arguing against is precisely this very thing, because if we accept the Isalat al-Wujud, then a cognation exists, albeit this cognation exists by virtue of an analogicity, a gradation. The being is one, it is one contiguous, all-pervasive being. It's just that there are gradations and levels of intensity and desensity and all of that. But the Ash'ari theology, and let alone the Mu'tazilite, it just cannot accept this, because if you attribute being in the way that these guys are doing, and which leads to someone like Ibn Arabi, then God by definition should exist in everything, including the idol. And the Sufi or the Akbarians would say absolutely, right? So these guys just, shirk. But their own position is shirk. And their own position leads to a kind of philosophical nihilism or ontological nihilism, because there is no relation between the divine and the world in that construct, right? And if that is the case, then this is a question that was asked. I think it's a valid question that Al-Ghazali asked. I don't agree with many of his other things, but the valid question that Al-Ghazali asked these people is then what is actually sending the prophets? If you are positing this level of transcendence and disconnection and severance between the divine and the world, then the whole question of the validity of this prophetic lineage and its scriptures and all of the whole thing of Tanzil becomes a farce. This is how far you've let this transit. So there must be a cognation. There must be some kind of relation between the world and its creator, or the absolute being. And so the resolution, of this question can only be in something either as the primacy of being in the way that Mulla Sadra posits it, or something quite close to that.
The second one I want to ask, it is little bit aside from the text, but again, here when we accept the analogicity of being, starting with the highest level, the real one, and proceed further down that everything, it doesn't matter how high it is in the hierarchy or how low. It is nevertheless, again, as Sabzavari mentions, it is alame. It is signed, a sign of this ultimate reality, and it is signed of this reality exactly by the virtue of its being, which very well, at least to my understanding, resembles, let's say, the Platonic understanding of the one and its emanation. But here, uh, some verses of the Quran sounds quite Gnostic in the dualistic, the better dualistic sense for me, which I cannot understand in this framework. Other ayats of Quran I get, but this they are problematic for me. For example, when it is saying خلق الموت والحياة, he created the dead on first place, and then the life. Or he خلق الظلمات والنور. He first create the darkness and then created the light. How can we put this Quranic ayat in this framework of analogicity of being?
Notice first thing that in these ayat, the negation, right, the naf comes before the isbat, right? This is in a way a reiteration of the meaning of the two phrases of the tahleel. La ilaha comes first, then illallah, right? So God manifests as the not and then brings forth itself in a sense. This is the reality of tajalli. It's not talking about the reality of the essence itself. It's talking about a modality of self-disclosure. So the zulma, the nothing, nilo, right, proceeds before the plenitude. Right? That which is not is before that which is. This is how this verse has been, so that then the negation, at least in a temporal sense, proceeds. So the reality of death, and by mot we mean that not even in the sense of non-existence, that something is inanimate, right? Inanimate as if it is dead, right? And then is resurrected to life or brought forth to life.
Okay, thank you very much, Sidi. So just to be sure that I'm getting the argument. So the first one, as we were talking before, it clears the ground of, let's say, any incorrect understanding, completely clears the ground. And then the second, it is the tajalli which illuminates the okay.
Let me put it to you this way. I think it is in his Sharh Tawhid al-Saduq, Qadi Sayyid Qummi, which was contemporaneous with the school of Isfahan, about a generation after Mulla Sadra. He has this part in his Sharh Tawhid al-Saduq I find very profound. He's kind of unpacking kun fayakun, be and it is, right? And this is what he says. He says that this vacuum of negation exists, as it were, within the fa of yakun. So if the command is to the be, right? This is already both affirmation and negation simultaneously. But before something comes into existence itself, if you take that particle fa and, right, that is the kind of the momentary negation before the existentiation of that thing. This is the way he puts it, which I find very, very profound. So this is how we can sort of get our head around. Does that answer the question?
Yes. Thank you very much.
Shane?
I don't have any questions today.
Okay.
I'm swimming around.
Okay. All right. Anyone else? Nate? Jeff?
I just want to clarify, like when you say vacuum, and you're talking about that level, well, you know what they say, God abhors a vacuum, or nature abhors a vacuum. So I think it's a little um, I'm not even sure what I want to say, but I just want to address the point that, like, there's a lot of talk about illusion and the illusory nature of ordinary material existence, and you just talked about the concept of I can't remember your words. The only word that's popping in my head is the word vacuum. For some reason, that just popped out at me, and I just wanted to say that everything is real, even at the lowest level of whatever spiritual hierarchy we might want to imagine. Um, there's reality there. I mean, there is no vacuum, right? So I just wanted to spit that out and see if you have anything intelligent to add to that or say about that.
There is no privation. Let's put it this way. I just mentioned that little gloss of Al-Qumi on the be and it is. He also says that, the reader should never, take a vacuum as meaning, a complete absence of privation. Because before there is an existent, there's always being, right? And the existent, as it were, it fills that locus of being in that, transitional state of its coming into being and passing out of existence, right? So there are no vacuums. Even if there's absence, there's presence, the presence being itself, existence.
Right. Sorry, I just wanted to say something, but I don't really like Shane. I don't have any questions right now. I'm swimming too, and not sure what to say, but this is a very interesting conversation. And yeah, that always seems to be the sticking point, how you go from, basically you're arguing, well, what is real? What is when you start talking about ultimate reality, and we're trying to bridge the gap between transcendence and immanence. And as you just mentioned, there's they're not really separate after all. You know what I mean? So that's the trap that a lot that you fall into intellectually, is you start to imagine, that everything at a basic level is illusory and somehow unreal, and also therefore not valuable. So
Or
it's
dead.
dangerous.
Well, it's like the notion that we have had since the so-called scientific revolution and the Enlightenment that matter is dead. There's no conscious matter, right? But then
Right.
the question arises, if matter is dead, then what explains the consciousness that brings matter to life in the form of scientific artifacts? Where does that come from? See, this is where modern science just cannot really get its head around this stuff with its way of approaching, with its empirical. Because matter is not dead. Matter has consciousness, right? From matter, things grow. There's cycles. Now they try to explain this away. Well, when you use the concept of life, you're trying to anthropomorphize matter, blah, blah, blah. But even when we don't anthropomorphize matter, right? Matter has life. Matter produces life. We are part of that. So then what then explains us in terms of, having a content of consciousness and reason and intelligence? And they cannot answer that question. Because then it enters into the realm of theology, and that's a problem for them.
Yeah. Thank you.
Sure. Anybody else? Nathan, we haven't heard from you today. You're there.
Hey, Wahid. Yeah, I'm here. Um, Regarding the concept of the gradations of being, I think this is a concept that we're all familiar with in various formulations, Sohravardi and the concept of the degrees of light to darkness. So, in reverse, I'm thinking that as I'm reading some of this stuff, and we may get to this in future sections, the spiritual path, the journey of the wayfarer, you're essentially going in reverse from less intense darkness toward the light, toward the source of illumination. You are leaving behind that darkness in so doing.
Yep.
And in every possible way.
Yes. And so this is, remember that little post I put yesterday on my Facebook wall. This is a fallacy that we have in our times where people believe that if you criticize something, you're hating on it. And
right.
Yeah, even if you're hating on it, my point of view is that we do things in a sort of a Zen-like way, that we're constantly engaging in this process of epistemic apophasis with every content in front of us. So this becomes the negation, the la ilaha, that we are then, as a result, moving towards the ispat, the perfect archetype, or the light and all of that stuff. And that occurs as a process within oneself. So one does that with oneself. You're negating, constantly negating. And then as a result of that, you are then pushing yourself into the real. But then the real is constantly transforming. As Ibn Arabi puts it, there's an incessant finding and losing. So then this entire process for the Salek, the wayfarer, is this constant process of negation, of affirmation of things, where each affirmation in turn then becomes a content of a negation to the level higher than itself. But then we are basically traversing the path of La ilaha illallah in literally everything that we're doing, everything we're cogitating, everything on a daily basis, whether in our interactions with the world or even with our interactions with our own self, just stripping ourselves. Very Zen-like, in that respect, but you're doing it actively. And so then the zikr of La ilaha illallah becomes basically your lived reality, from that darkness of incomprehension to that light of the noetic realization of the reality itself.
That makes perfect sense. I think the Zen analogy really nails it for me too. There's a sense in which you are you're really sifting through your own subjective content that filters raw reality for you. And you're deciding what is leading you astray versus what is leading you back to reality.
Exactly. Right. And, as both of us are watching right now online with this second iteration of idiocracy, it's like, the masses are stuck in their idol. So,
right.
They are kind of inhabiting that reality of idolatry, whereas the times now require Moses's of various iterations to, cast that golden calf down, even at detriment to themselves. And so this becomes our thing. The activism, whether on or offline, is part of that whole process of Tawheed and the Tahlil and realizing it. So when when you're engaging in that saluk in the inner world, then you have to take that saluk out into the outer world. So then this becomes the greater jihad, lesser jihad, simultaneously unfolding in real life, which I call the most supreme jihad, the jihad al-azam, where you're doing these things both simultaneously, and there's no difference. You're not hiding anywhere. You're engaging in a khalwat and jaman, the retreat within society, but you're active in it at the same time. You're retreating within yourself, in your inner self, but then you're acting on the world.
Yeah, I think that's very beautifully put, and I think it's very necessary in this time. We don't really need individualistic illumination. We need collective illuminations as well.
100%. But even if the collective illumination doesn't come, if there are enough people out there doing this, even becoming the object of the scorn of multitudes, the job is being done. This is the Malami path. This is the path of blame, which according to the school of Ibn Arabi is the highest of the stations that any Gnostic can attain. When you're starting to be hated on by multitudes, you're doing something right. Yeah.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Yeah. Sure. Yeah.
That just makes me think of Oh, sorry.
Go for it. No, sorry.
I just had to look up right quick didactic. That's just me. My memory sucks when it comes to memorizing a billion cajillion different terms, so I always have to refer to a dictionary every time I read something or hear something. So with didactic, I found it funny, like here, I'll just read this little bit. In the manner of a teacher, particularly so is to treat someone in a patronizing way. And that just made me giggle because can't tell you how many times I've been accused of being patronizing. And it's kind of funny. Like that's what you just reminded me of. That's where the hate comes from. Like people want to reject and put you down and hate you because you're patronizing them. And I'm not saying being patronizing in and of itself is any kind of admirable quality, but if there's a teacher who's trying to teach and the student is irritated by the method of the teacher, then well, I'm not even sure what I'm trying to say, but there's a hostility generated between the student.
If you look at your own psychology, right? I mean, before we judge other people, let's look at our own psychology. An idea comes forth that is true, but it may upset your comfort or your notion of what that truth is. You yourself will react against that at first, right? Until if you then, kind of examine the idea, try to go deeper into the idea and dissect the idea, analyze the idea, and internalize the idea, then you say, oh, wow, yeah, this is true. I accept it. But the vast majority of people are reactive, right? So if something comes out, their first reaction is to hate on it. I don't like this. Why? Because it makes me feel uncomfortable. Makes me feel uncomfortable. They don't examine whether this is true, what relevance it has, what implications it has, all of these various things. They don't look at that. It's about them, right? So a spiritual path, any kind of spiritual path, the first thing that they are trying to teach you is that in the face of these incessant outpourings of things in the world, right? If you're going to react, at least react from a point of view of knowledge about that thing, right? So that you're then reacting from a place of understanding when you do react, or you don't react at all. You can react. There's no problem with reacting to the false, right? Or anything else. But react with understanding. Have some kind of a gnosis or knowledge or anything of that thing, rather than from a completely closed, ignorant place where you don't have any comprehension of what this thing is and its dimensions, and you're reacting because it makes you feel uncomfortable or it contradicts your notions of who you are. So it's all about your ego. Right? Like what we're seeing today throughout the West, where this whole anti-immigration debate, the anti-immigration debate is so dumb on so many different levels, but the multitudes who have been kind of pulled into this narrative are not looking at it from that perspective. They're looking at it from their own perspective. These immigrants are coming and taking our gerbs, they're going to come and take my plasma TV screen, or they're eating the dogs and the cats. According to Donald Trump in that debate with Kamala Harris, that I couldn't believe. But that's the mentality, rather than, no average conservative voter is looking at the issue of mass immigration from the point of view of, say, a trade unionist, that, maybe if immigration is weaponized by elites, what this is going to do is going to impoverish the rights of indigenous or native workers in a particular place. So then how do we solve this problem if we're having a problem of mass immigration? Well, all these immigrant workers, even if they're undocumented, we should accept these people into our trade union structure, so that then collective bargaining in a workplace kind of situation is inclusive of all of these immigrants that are coming. So then that becomes then the union movement becomes more powerful in relation to the employer. But they're not looking at it from that perspective. I mean, they don't. First of all, they have a reaction against trade unionism as an idea, because this whole communist label has been placed on trade unionism in the West. So they're thinking about themselves. I don't like these people coming taking my job. I don't like these darkies coming and dating my daughter. I don't like it. But yet these darkies are coming and picking your fruit. They're manning your cafes. They're making your food. They're responsible for taking care of you, because why? Most of the citizenry of the United States and Canada and Europe are unwilling to work in these industries for the kind of salaries that they're giving them. right? But the vast majority of people out there are not thinking from these perspectives.
Yeah, there seems to be definitely the light and darkness metaphor works here. There seems to be a darkness on people's hearts and minds. And there are people who materially benefit from keeping them that way
Yes.
and getting people invested in staying that way. And if you can drop as many facts as you want, use as many rational arguments as you want, you cannot penetrate. These people have to actually taste reality before they wake up.
Yeah. And you know, this was my conclusion about last year's election. If the electorate is this dumb, then they need to get a taste of this very bitter medicine and swallow it. So as Donald Trump begins to tank the American economy and people's livelihoods in the Rust Belt start to decline very rapidly, and then inflation rather than declining, rising where they can't afford anything, and their mortgages start to go up, the rates and the banks are just really pushing for their mortgages, then they realize that, hey, maybe we made a mistake. Maybe this guy isn't any better than this other party. You know, they got an experience. It's a let them experience. Unfortunately, the rest of us also have to suffer their stupidity. You know, what do you do?
Yeah, exactly.
What the world? God almighty. Hey, folks, if there's not that many other questions, let's call it a day for today. We've just gone for an hour, and then we'll come back again at the same time and read the next two sections. Also, just, you know, to inform yourself, read these sections in Sabzavari as well. Just even, you know, glean them, because there's a lot of overlap. I'm just not going to read the text of Sabzavari in each session, because it's just to like be sitting here for about 45 minutes just reading it. So, but if you have questions on Sabzavari, write them down for each session. And then we can come and also then discuss both of these texts together at the same time. And if you want to put it in the Telegram group for discussion, go for that as well, no problem. Anywho, let's leave it here for this week, and we'll come back again next week at the same time. Until next time, Yallah.